So I just got back from a trip to Los Angeles, never been. And while I was there, I was driving around like Beverly Hills area. And I was looking around, I was trying to notice what kind of cars I saw, trying to see if it felt any different from what I see kind of day to day. And yes and no, like there was definitely more of the sort of what we'd call luxury cars, more BMWs, more Mercedes, like that. And then also definitely some other like higher tier, like sports car types of things that I don't really see every day, Lamborghini, stuff like that. But anyway, all that got me to thinking back to this idea I've seen around a lot. And if you've kind of read other personal finance literature, financial literacy stuff, you maybe have seen this before, this idea that wealthy people don't buy expensive cars. So you may have seen people like, Dave Ramsey say this, or some websites have kind of written up articles about this. This idea comes from a book that is super popular in the personal finance world called The Millionaire Next Door. In maybe a separate video or maybe a series of videos, I'll talk about why I absolutely hate this book. But it does this. The book does this survey and interview research of millionaires across the United States and learns about their spending habits, their backgrounds, their jobs, stuff like that, and compiled the data in this book and wrote a book about it. For one, I don't know why people never seem to actually cite the source for this, which is weird. Maybe it's because the source is about 30 years old, so there's that. But there's also like 4 other main issues, at least, that I see with this claim. For one, is just the obvious thing that correlation is not causation. Hopefully you've heard that phrase before. But just because 2 things go together doesn't mean that one causes the other, even if it may seem on the surface like that could be plausible. So people often will pull out these statistics or this data from this book to say that people who are wealthy, who have made it in life, got there because they were frugal. They didn't waste their money on super expensive things, especially things like cars. Just because those 2 things go together doesn't mean that one causes the other. And the data that I've seen doesn't really provide evidence that that's the case. Another problem is that there is alternative data out there that's in some ways newer that contradicts this. So look at this kind of example, this chart showing the amount of money people spend on their cars based upon their income level. And you'll see people in the highest income level spend a lot of money on their cars. So the implication being that they seem to buy much more expensive cars. The other problem kind of speaks to some of the problems I have with the data as a whole, and that the data is based on interviews and surveys. So they find people who are millionaires, they sent them a survey and sat down with some of them for interviews and asked them, what job do you have? How much money do you make? What car do you drive? When have you bought your last car? How many kids do you have? Stuff like that. And that's the whole basis of this data. It was interviews and surveys, which can be useful, but also are subject to dishonesty. We're just trusting the word of these people that these are actually their spending habits. You could see someone maybe who answered this question, well, like I drive a Honda day to day, but I also own this sports car that I have for fun. But maybe they just said Honda because that's the first thing that came to mind, or because they don't want to appear rich there. And then the last big problem I have with this data is that it didn't really control for geography or age as much as I can tell. Like I should probably dig into it a little bit more. It's been a while since I've read it, but from my understanding is that they just identified millionaires across the country and didn't distinguish between millionaires who live in high cost of living areas like California, Massachusetts, the coasts, and millionaires who maybe lived in lower costs of living areas. And this is important for a lot of different reasons. One is that where I live in Massachusetts, people who would be considered upper class by national standards, people who make, 150, 200 or more a year are really in this area because of the high cost of living are really, we could say lower upper class or upper middle class. And those are still the same sorts of people who are probably likely to buy Hondas, Toyotas, just like someone else who would be middle class in other parts of the country. And similarly for age, someone who is retired in Massachusetts who has maybe $1.5 million is actually lower middle class, right? Because $1.5 million is actually not a whole lot to retire on. You're not in a great position, honestly, for retirement, depending on other factors, whether you're working or get Social Security, stuff like that. But someone like that might buy cheaper cars, but that doesn't mean that they are like what we would consider a super wealthy person who buys cheap cars, if that makes sense. So all that to say is like this idea could be right. It could be correct that people who have made it in life have done so because they were frugal and they spent below their means. And I think definitely that's an important value, and that's a good thing. And I'm not taking away from anyone trying to say that that's important. But I have some questions about this data and the way it's kind of used to make people feel shame for their choices, or make them feel hyper responsible if their life is not going the way that they want, that it's their fault if they're not super wealthy. Lives are a lot more complicated than that. Wealth and wealth building is a lot more complicated than that. And I just don't think these narratives are really that simple.